Kevin O'Connor of The Ringer knows Phil Perry is just going to be upset with Brad Stevens here, I think, at some moment I'm not sure why. Kevin O'Connor, after listening, feels like I don't know why everybody's on me today, just because I'm negative about Brad Stevens and the Celtics.
This will be a great conversation.
Kevin O'Connor, how do you feel after listening to Brad Stevens today? Do you think they're just content to roll with the exact same team they put on the floor last year?
Boston is definitely content to roll back and get some player development, but I don't think Brad Stevens said anything in that, presser today that makes me feel that, he's not going to try for big moves. The question is for Boston is there a big move even worth going for this offseason? And for them, maybe it's the type of thing where you wait until the NBA regular season before the deadline to make a big move if necessary. But I agree with Stevens' evaluation of the Celtics. What's missing more than anything else is playmaking. That's where they need help. They need somebody to fill what they wished Dennis Schroeder could have been, somebody who could bring more than White or Smart as a passer.
Phil, when we did our call this afternoon for this very show, it was just a few hours after Brad Stevens talked, and you seemed a little dejected, a little disappointed. Why don't you feel like things are going to get better and Brad Stevens is going to make, as Kevin O'Connor suggested, maybe a big move or at least some moves that are going to make this team better?
I think they very well could get better, and I think they will make moves. I don't think that Brad Stevens is necessarily content with the roster, but what I think and what I feel like I know now, after listening to both Brad Stevens and Wyc Grousbeck today, is that there will not be a big move coming. There will not be a splash move coming. Marcus Smart is here to stay. Rob Williams is here to stay. Of course, the Jays are here to stay. I think Al Horford is here to stay until further notice. I think all of the major pieces will all be back. I even heard today talk about moves along the margins of the roster and the fact that they don't want to rock the boat when it comes to their identity, because if you change too many pieces, you could shift your identity in a direction that's not as successful, when the reality is you could also change some pieces and shift your identity in a way that is actually more successful. And I know they were very close to winning an NBA Finals this year, but I think to look at the result from this season is not necessarily sound process. I think the process should be, and I think this is what they're going to try to do, I just don't know if they're going to be willing to do anything drastic, is how do we improve? How do we just make our team better? It's not, wow, we got so close and we don't want to do anything to necessarily mess with that. It should be, in my opinion, we need to get better at X, Y, and Z, and we need to be willing and open to anything, including a big move, to make sure we get better in those regards.
But Kevin, I would argue, and Phil, you can respond to this as well, I would argue that was said today. It was said by Brad Stevens that the offense wasn't good enough. They need playmaking. They need people to move the ball. They need to add a pure scorer on the bench.
The owner also said, Trenni, that they are not trading any big pieces today. So, I think they watched our show yesterday, and they saw us talk about Bradley Beal, KOC, and they saw us talk about Marcus Smart potentially moving on from him, and they laughed. I think they laughed their asses off. I think that's what happened yesterday. They are not trading any of these guys, and I think we just have to come to accept that right now. I think we're going to be talking about bench pieces from here on out, and that's all well and good. I think they could get better if they do that. I don't know. I'm not certain it's enough, and it sounds to me like they're sort of closed off to potentially making a splash. That's all.
I think along those lines is it has to do with who's available. Even with Bradley Beal, you could say, theoretically, if Beal were available, you could flip Derek White with Daniel Tice and Nesmith and have the money together to get Beal in a sign and trade. The problem is it seems like Bradley Beal is going to go back to Washington on a 5-year Supermax contract. I mean, we'll see if he actually makes that decision in the end, but all indications are around the league that's what's going to happen. So for Boston, I just don't know if there's a big name player out there that makes any sense for them that's actually acquirable right now. So for them, it's like they might not be trading these quote unquote key places on Marcus Smart, or Derek White, these rotation guys, because there's just not anything out there right now that makes sense. So it's about keeping your flexibility, which Boston has with the types of salaries they have on their roster.
As we deep dive more into the Celtics, Kevin O'Connor still is here. Amina Smith is finally, don't worry, she's finally to take a vacation next week. Just make her work through the draft before we allow her to go. Amina, Wyc says they don't need they don't need to blow anything up. And I think most of us agree with that. But is it just tweaks, or do they need a little more than tweaks?
I'm somewhere between not like a big major move, but then also making tweaks to this roster, because we can't forget that this team made it to the NBA Finals. So you look at this core, and obviously something is working, but they do need something a little bit more. Also, why do we keep talking about Bradley Beal coming to Boston? Trenni, it's not happening. I don't understand. I understand
he's
that
Jason Tatum's best friend.
I know, they're best friends. People want to hear it. They want to hear that Bradley Beal is so in love with Jason Tatum and wants to come play here in Boston. It's not happening.
He cried. He cried with Taylor Rooks. Of course he's coming to Boston, Kevin.
It's definitely not happening. And Kevin even mentioned it at the top of the show, talking about all roads are pretty much leading to Bradley Beal staying with the Washington Wizards. But coming back to the Boston Celtics, I really don't think that blowing up this roster and making this huge move is anything that's necessary. We saw that this season, everything worked out in terms of chemistry, especially the challenges that they faced early on in the season. They were able to turn things around. If I'm Wyc Grousbeck, if I'm anybody in that front office, Trenni, I don't want to make a huge move to change the chemistry with this group.
Yeah, and I think that's what Brad Stevens alluded to today, that he doesn't, that it's very fragile, right? Like they took Dennis Schroeder out, Kevin, and they plugged Derek White in. And although they didn't win the title, it completely changed the trajectory of the season. But some people will also look at the year and say, okay, and even today on our call, we were saying, much to the chagrin of our big boss, Kevin Miller, well, if Chris Middleton would have been healthy, maybe we're not even talking about a finals run. Like the Celtics caught some breaks along the way, which does make you wonder, Kevin, are tweaks enough, or do you need a little bit more for this team to get over the hump and win a title?
I mean, tweaks alone aren't enough for the Celtics. Like they need Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown to continue making progress as the great young players that they are. So tweaks aren't enough. You need your best players to get even better. They're only 24 and 25 years old, respectively. So in addition to that, yes, they do need tweaks. They need more playmaking, but most importantly is that Tatum and Brown continue to improve. It doesn't matter what tweaks you make if those guys stay the same.
Do you trust, though, the guys on this roster, Amina, that you've watched? Like, I think most of us look at Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and we see the progression they made, especially with Tatum. I know no one wants to hear this excuse, but he just looked gassed at the end of the year. And I think that will change. I think he learned a lot. But there are some guys, like, how much better can Derek White really get? How much better can Aaron Nesmith get and Peyton Pritchard? Like, is there a move that is middle of the road that would make them significantly better?
Yeah, I agree with you. I do feel like Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, they definitely took steps forward this season. Even Rob Williams took a huge step forward this season. When you talk about the fringe of this roster, though, the guys are supposed to come in and help out and offensively help out, the Derek Whites, the Grant Williams, the Aaron Nesmith, that's where I'm kind of like, okay, maybe some tweaks along the bench is what you need. And you saw that in the finals as well. I think they were outscored 20-5 in that game. Game 6. It was completely awful. And so when you take a look at the tweaks in terms of, you know, those players who are supposed to help supplement Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, that's where I see maybe changes happening.
Well, Amina, you are not the only one. Such a great host. That's the perfect segue. A good story about the Celtics on ESPN.com. And this said, they still need a real point guard. I love Marcus, but he needs another person to help him, and it can't be Tatum and Brown because they dribble too much. They need someone else. If Utah looks to move a guy like Mike Conley, can you put him in there, someone like that?
If you ask me right now what we need, I'd like to have a little bit more scoring, consistent scoring off the bench. And you know, I think that we have some short-term needs there, but I believe in a couple of the guys that didn't get a chance to play as much, that they will continue to improve and be knocking on that door soon. So we have some development opportunities within our own organization. And, you know, we'll continue to scour and look at what our opportunities are with our, you know, trade exceptions in the draft and, you know, our limited resources in free agency.
All right, the quote from the executive was about the point guard needing an upgrade. Brad Stevens there talking about the bench needing some help and some scoring. You might be able to fix both of those if Kevin O'Connor and Phil Perry are here with me now, if maybe you get some more bench scoring. Kevin, what are some options? How do they bolster this bench so that, and I keep going back to, when Steph Curry needed a breather, he could go take a breather for 3, 4, sometimes 5 minutes. And you had guys like Jordan Poole and Andrew Wiggins who could carry them offensively, sometimes Klay Thompson as well. The Celtics just didn't have that when Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum weren't clicking. Is there a guy out there that can cure that?
I think for Boston, Stevens said it. They're limited with free agency. They have their $6 million taxpayer mid-level exception. They have the $17 million traded player exception that they could use to acquire a player. I'm thinking about guys like Bruce Brown from Brooklyn, the type of playmaking he could provide off the bench, real dirty work guy, Massachusetts native also, by the way, or TJ Warren from Indiana. He was injured last year. You would need to gauge what his health is, but that's what Stevens talked about. He says more consistent scoring off the bench. Warren is a 40+% shooter off the catch from 3-point range, so he can play off of all of Boston's other ball handlers. But the dude is a bucket getter. From mid-range, his ability to get to the basket, he can provide some of that penetration to get into the paint that the Celtics did lack this year, in addition to the fact that he's big. Like, he's 6'8", he can defend multiple positions. He's not a stopper by any means, but he's no liability. So he's somebody that can make sense in a sign-and-trade scenario for Boston.
Yeah, the executive, by the way, who didn't like Marcus Smart, also said the bench for the C's, a lot of scrubs. But as you heard me say, Phil, that same East executive doesn't like the Celtics point guard situation. He brought up the name Mike Conley. Is that a name that would make you happy? Even if they kept, let's just say for argument's sake, they don't make a major move like you think they will not, and they keep Marcus Smart, but they bring in a guy like Conley. Does that help them?
Oh, definitely. I'd completely be open to that kind of move where you're not necessarily moving someone out who is a big part of your identity, who does a lot for you on the defensive end, as Marcus Smart does, and brings a lot of value there, but you're still getting a little bit more ball handling, a little bit more ability to run a half-court offense potentially, especially in pressure situations, maybe end-of-game situations. If they can somehow upgrade that part of that point guard role and say, Marcus, you're still our guy, but we just want to bring somebody in, whether it's Mike Conley, who I like a lot. Like, I think Mike Conley is a true point guard. He could play almost 30 minutes for you. He'd get you 5-6 assists. If it's Conley, if it's Patty Mills probably be an even lesser name, but somebody that you could add with one of those exceptions that the Celtics have right now. I think they just need someone who can settle them down at that position. And to me, Conley would certainly fit that bill.
Kevin, do any of those names make sense? Are those moves that could happen for the Celtics? And do they need an upgrade at the point guard situation? Or do you think if they got someone who could score more off the bench and take that pressure off Marcus Smart, that everything else would just sort of fall into place and he'd be a more suitable point guard?
I mean, Marcus Smart is going to have to be the one who makes the decision whether he's, jacking 10+ shots per game or not, regardless of who else is coming off the bench. So I think for Boston, I agree with Phil's mindset. Mike Conley is not the guy that I love. He's 35 years old. He's declined so much. He gets worse every year. He might be able to provide you some good minutes as a reliable point guard, but I'd rather wait if I'm the Celtics rather than cash in some chips right now for him. And I mean, other guys that are available, like a D'Angelo Russell, for example, a younger guy who fits the timeline, somebody like him, I'd love to see what he could do surrounded by a Tatum and a Brown. Not that he is a target for Boston, but that's just the way I'm kind of thinking about it. Is like, who's someone that's younger, that fits the timeline, that could also help provide some of the playmaking needs that your team has.
Kevin, are we too hard on Marcus Smart? Is he getting unfairly crushed?
Yeah, I think so. I think with Marcus Smart, the intangibles, the way he's such a connector on defense, some of the stuff he provides goes so beyond the box score. It's stuff that happens on the plane rides, in the locker room, in the huddle. I mean, the way this dude just hustles and the way he sets a tone for his team, I don't think you can really measure that. And with that said, though, he is a replaceable player because almost everybody's replaceable. As Danny Ainge said for years when he ran the Celtics, if Stevens is operating of that similar mindset, he's not going to be hesitating to trade anybody on this team, including Marcus Smart, if it means having a big upgrade. But I don't think that big upgrade is there for a trade right now.
Phil, I feel like I could see like the smoke coming out of your ears when
people
the word intangibles
people think I
mentioned.
hate Marcus Smart, Kevin, and it's just not the case. I've said many times before that he brings value to the team. But to your point, they should at least be open to looking to move people that aren't named Jalen and Jason on the roster if it could make the overall team better. We heard a lot about, moving, pieces out to maybe bring somebody in, and it would totally sap everything that they're about. You don't necessarily have to do that. You have a pretty strong core with your head coach and your 2 stars right now. I think you could move some other pieces on that roster and still be the Boston Celtics that you love and that team that you established this year.
Well, speaking of those stars, Jason Tatum clearly ran out of steam in the NBA Finals, but Brad Stevens still very impressed by his young star and delivered a simple message to Tatum this offseason.
I just told him go on vacation, like go get some rest. I mean, this guy gave us everything he had. What Jason and Jalen have done in the playoffs historically at their ages is, rarefied air. And so I think we're very cognizant of the fact that, even though Jason would admittedly not have played his best series, there's no chance we're there without him.
All right, so at the end of every season, guys, Amina Smith rejoining us now as well. Players always do exit interviews, right? And it's like a progress report, a report card at the end of a school year. If you guys could give Jalen and Jason an exit interview, I'm curious what you would say. If it was me, I would tell them both I'm very proud of their growth, that they took huge leaps this year, and they would not have been in the NBA Finals without either of them. And then I would hand them both, I don't know how, a DVD, I don't know, how do people watch things anymore? Like give them a link on YouTube of some highlights I put together of them throwing the ball into the stands instead of passing it to an actual human being on the court, or dribbling off their left foot and just losing their mind when the refs don't give them a call that they don't like, so that they can see Amina and grow, because those were things that really hurt them in the end, the fact that they could not keep their composure.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I feel like Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, they took huge step forward this season, and the Celtics wouldn't have been in the NBA Finals without them, especially with Jaylen Brown, how he took command sometimes in the series throughout the playoffs when Jason Tatum couldn't get going. But then also on the flip side, just like you mentioned, the first thing I think of, those turnovers. 100 turnovers for Jason Tatum in the postseason, the most in NBA history. That's like the number one thing that I would talk to Jason Tatum about. And also Jaylen Brown. I mean, the left hand dribbling from him in the postseason, goodness gracious. I don't know what kind of drills he needs to do in the offseason, but just do all of them. Do all of the drills.
Is it just the left hand dribbling?
Look, I don't know. Phil's looking at me.
No,
the left hand was never good for him.
I think that's a very fair critique, and that's what I would say to Jaylen Brown in terms of what can you do to improve this offseason and make yourself a better player. I think ball handling would have to be at the top of the list. And then for Tatum, Kevin, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts too. For Tatum, I feel like, and this is fresh off of Draymond Green comparing Tatum to Kevin Durant, which is obviously a lofty comparison. But one thing that I love about Durant's game is that everything happens offensively so easily for him. And I think things could get a lot easier for Jason Tatum if he got more comfortable with just a little mid-range game. I know it's not the NBA anymore, but just being able to rise up and take those 15-footers when they're there, as opposed to every time being a three-point attempt or an attempt right at the rim. But what do you think Tatum could do to improve?
I mean, he absolutely does need to become a more efficient mid-range scorer, especially out of isolation situations. I mean, it's always been a skill for him, but he's never near the top of the league in scoring efficiency out of isolation. So getting better in that way is partially from mid-range, like you said, but it's also about getting to the basket, drawing fouls, getting quality attempts right at the rim instead of some of these weird, angle layups that he takes. So, Trenni, you mentioned showing him some video. I'd love to show him a supercut of Jimmy Butler, different types of players, but watch that guy and how he uses his body to get into the basket, draw free throws, and get to the line. That's the next step for Tatum and for Brown, to be true superstar scorers on a nightly basis, even when the shot's not falling.
Hey, put on all that muscle. Now use it next year.